Margaret Sullivan. The moment I said my mother's name, the Admiral's face went pale. He stopped breathing for a second. His hand, still extended from our handshake, slowly dropped to his side. His eyes became glassy, and I watched a decorated 4-star officer look suddenly less like a powerful man, and more like someone who had just been pulled into a painful memory. "Your mother," he whispered. "Yes, sir." His eyes moved to my wrist, then back to my face. "What is your name?" "Ren Sullivan." He took one step backward. I had been assigned to pick him up at the airport, not uncover a secret that had apparently survived for almost 30 years. And yet, standing beneath the fluorescent lights of the terminal, I knew something had changed the instant I saw that tattoo. It was an old-fashioned compass on his wrist, its needle pointing toward the Big Dipper. My mother had the exact same tattoo, same design, same spot. I had seen it countless times while growing up. I remembered tracing the faded ink with my finger when I was a little girl, asking Mom what it meant. She had always smiled sadly and said, "It reminds me that some promises are worth keeping, even when keeping them hurts." She never explained more. Now, the man standing in front of me wore the same symbol. "Sir," I said carefully, "are you all right?" He swallowed. "Does your mother still live in Virginia?" The question hit me harder than his reaction. "How do you know my mother?" He looked away. For several seconds, the noise of the airport seemed to disappear around us. Travelers rolled suitcases across the polished floor while announcements echoed overhead. But I heard only my own heartbeat. "I asked you a question, Admiral." He looked at me. "I knew your mother a long time ago." "How long?" He hesitated. "Before you were born." My stomach tightened. I had spent most of my life believing my father had simply walked away. Mom never spoke badly about him. She only said he had chosen a different life. As a child, I accepted that. As I got older, I stopped asking. But now a 4-star admiral was looking at me as though my existence was something he had never expected to see. I forced myself back into military professionalism. "I was assigned to get you to your hotel, sir." "Yes." His voice sounded distant. He picked up his briefcase, but before we walked away, he looked at me again. "Ren, does your mother know you work with the Navy?" "She does." "Does she know you were assigned to pick me up?" "No. I didn't know who the passenger was until this morning." He nodded slowly. Then he said something that made the hair rise on my arms. Maybe that was for the best. We walked through the airport together. I kept my questions to myself until we reached the parking garage. The moment we got into the government vehicle, I closed the door and looked at him. "Who are you to my mother?" He stared through the windshield. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his uniform jacket and pulled out a small, worn envelope. The paper had yellowed. There was one name written across the front, Margaret Sullivan. My breath caught. "Where did you get that?" "I've carried it for 29 years. Why?" "Because I thought I was never going to get the chance to return it. I took the envelope but didn't open it." "What's inside?" "A letter from my mother." He nodded. "Then why didn't you give it to her?" His jaw tightened. "Because I never received it." I stared at him. "That doesn't make sense." It didn't make sense to me either. Not for a very long time. He turned toward me. "Ren, your mother and I loved each other." The words landed with a strange weight. I had never imagined that the man my mother loved could be standing beside me in a Navy parking garage, wearing 4 stars on his shoulders. I looked at the tattoo again, the compass. His fingers covered it instinctively. She gave me the idea. "Why?" "Because we were both young enough to believe we could keep a promise forever." His voice cracked slightly. "What promise?" He looked down at the envelope. "That no matter where the Navy sent us, we'd find our way back to each other." I didn't know what to say. Then I remembered something from my childhood. My mother sitting alone at the kitchen table late one night, holding her wrist beneath the lamp. She had whispered he was supposed to come back. At the time, I thought she meant my father. Now I wasn't so sure. The Admiral seemed to read the realization on my face. "Ren," he said quietly, "what has your mother told you about your father?" "Not much." "What did she say that he left?" His eyes closed. "And you believed her?" "I was a child." He nodded. "I know, there was something in the way he said those words that made me angry. You know." He opened his eyes. "I know because I believed the same thing about her." The silence between us felt enormous. I looked down at the envelope in my hands. For the first time, I wondered whether the story my mother had protected me from was not a story about abandonment at all. Maybe it was a story about betrayal. Maybe someone had lied, and if someone had lied, I needed to know why. The Admiral started the engine, but before he pulled out of the parking space, he looked at me one last time. Don't call your mother yet. Why? Because if I'm right, she has spent almost 30 years believing something that isn't true. He paused. And Ren, if she knows that you're standing here with me, she may finally tell you everything. I looked down at the envelope again. My mother's name was written across it, in handwriting I had never seen before. That envelope was about to change everything I believed about my family. I didn't open the envelope that night. I carried it back to my apartment and placed it on the kitchen counter, where I stared at it for nearly an hour. My mother's name was still there in faded ink. Margaret Sullivan. The same woman who had raised me alone. The same woman who had always avoided questions about my father. And now I knew the man standing beside me at the airport believed he had once loved her. I couldn't stop thinking about what the Admiral had said. Your mother and I loved each other. There was no hesitation in his voice when he said it. No attempt to impress me. No pride, only regret. The next morning I drove to my mother's house. She lived in a quiet neighborhood outside Norfolk in a modest brick ranch she had owned for years. Her front porch had 2 rocking chairs, although she rarely used them. She preferred sitting in the kitchen with a cup of coffee and the morning newspaper. When I walked through the door, she looked up. You're early. I need to ask you something. She immediately put down her coffee. Is something wrong? I placed the envelope on the table. Her face changed, not dramatically, just enough. Her fingers stopped moving. She stared at her own name. Where did you get that? The Admiral gave it to me. She looked at me. Which Admiral? Thomas Callahan. The color drained from her face. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then she whispered, You met Thomas at the airport. You were assigned to pick him up. Yes. She closed her eyes. I had never seen my mother look frightened before. Not when I enlisted, not when I deployed, not even when she had undergone surgery years earlier. But now her hands were trembling. Mom, I said softly. Who is Thomas Callahan? She didn't answer. Who is he to you? Still nothing. I pulled out a chair and sat across from her. He showed me his wrist. Her eyes lifted. The tattoo. She looked away. An old-fashioned compass, I continued, the needle pointing toward the Big Dipper. My mother's lips began to tremble. He has the same tattoo you have. She pressed her hand over her mouth. I waited. Finally, she whispered, He was supposed to come back. That sentence stopped me cold. I remembered hearing those exact words when I was a little girl. He was supposed to come back. I had always assumed she meant my father. Now I knew better. Was Thomas Callahan my father? She looked at me, and for the first time in my life I saw the answer before she said it. Yes. The room seemed to tilt. I stood up, then sat back down. No, I'm sorry. You told me my father left. I told you what I believed. You knew his name. Yes. You knew where he was. I didn't know where he was for most of your childhood. But you knew he was Thomas. She lowered her eyes. Yes. I felt anger rising in my chest. Not because she had kept a secret. Because I suddenly understood how much of my childhood had been built around that secret. Why didn't you tell me? Because I thought he chose not to know you. I stared at her. He said the same thing about you. My mother looked up sharply. What? He thought you left him. Her expression broke. No, he said he believed you abandoned him. She shook her head. I never abandoned Thomas. Then what happened? She stood and walked to a cabinet near the dining room. For a moment, she simply rested her hand on the handle. Then she opened it. Behind a stack of old cookbooks was a small wooden box. She carried it to the table. Inside were photographs, letters, military papers, and a folded piece of fabric. She picked up one photograph. It showed a younger version of my mother standing beside a man in a Navy uniform, Thomas Callahan. They were both smiling, not the polite smile people use for photographs. A real smile, the kind that reaches the eyes. My mother turned the photograph over. On the back in faded handwriting were 4 words. Find your way home. She handed it to me. We made those tattoos after Thomas received orders overseas. She said, You both got them? Yes. Why the Big Dipper? She smiled sadly. He said sailors needed stars. I almost laughed, but I couldn't, she continued. The compass meant direction. The stars meant home. We promised that no matter what happened, we would find our way back. What happened? Her expression hardened. Someone lied to both of us, who she looked toward the window. Captain Richard Hayes. The name meant nothing to me, but my mother clearly remembered it. He served with Thomas. She said he was ambitious, very ambitious. What did he do? He told me Thomas had moved on, that he had decided our relationship was a mistake. Then he told Thomas that I wanted nothing more to do with him. That was a lie. Yes. My mother opened another drawer and pulled out a bundle of letters tied with blue ribbon. I wrote Thomas dozens of times. I looked at the envelopes. Some had been returned, others had never been opened. You never sent them. I sent everyone. My throat tightened. Then why didn't he get them? I don't know. I looked at the letters again. Mom, what about me? She sat down. I found out I was pregnant after Thomas was deployed, and you told him I tried. Did he know? I don't think so. Her voice broke. I waited for a response that never came. I understood then. The anger I had carried toward my father for years had been built on a story neither of us had written. My mother reached for my hand. Ren, I never wanted you to grow up hating him. I did hate him. I know. I thought he didn't want me. She squeezed my fingers. He never knew. I looked down at the letters. One envelope was dated 3 months before I was born. The handwriting was unmistakably my mother's. I opened it carefully. The first line read, Thomas, if you are reading this, then someone finally let my letter reach you. I stopped breathing because underneath that sentence was another line, and it was written in a different hand, returned, do not forward. I knew then that the lie hadn't simply separated two people. It had taken a father from his daughter before either of us ever had the chance to meet. I read the letter 3 times before I could make sense of what I was seeing. My mother had written to Thomas from the hospital where she worked. She had told him about the pregnancy, about the baby she was carrying, and about how desperately she wanted him to come home. But beneath her words was that handwritten instruction returned, do not forward. I looked at my mother. Who wrote this? I don't know. You must have some idea. She shook her head. I knew something was wrong, Ren. I just didn't know how wrong. I gathered the letters and took them home with me. That night, I called Admiral Callahan. He answered, on the second ring. Ren, I found the letters. There was silence. All of them. Not all. Enough. He exhaled slowly. Your mother told you. She told me you were my father. Enough. Silence. Then I heard his voice change. Ren, I need you to tell me your side. I will. Everything, I promise. The following afternoon, we met at a small diner outside Norfolk. It wasn't the kind of place where anyone expected to see a 4-star admiral. That was exactly why Callahan chose it. He arrived civilian clothes. A navy blue jacket, white shirt, no medals, no rank insignia. For the first time, he looked less like an admiral and more like an older man who had spent years carrying something heavy. He sat across from me. I loved your mother, he said. I know. She was the strongest woman I had ever met. Then why didn't you go looking for her? His eyes lowered. Because I believed she didn't want me because of Richard Hayes. He nodded. Hayes was my superior for a time. He was smart, well-connected, and very good at making people believe what he wanted them to believe. What exactly did he tell you? Callahan looked toward the window. He told me Margaret had written to him. He said she wanted to end our relationship. Did you see the letter? No. Then why believe him? Because he showed me a copy. My anger rose. What did it say? That Margaret had met someone else? That she wanted a normal life? That she didn't want a Navy officer coming back into her life? That wasn't her. I know that now. You should have known then. He didn't defend himself. You're right. That answer surprised me, he continued. I was young, I was angry, and I was being deployed again. Hayes told me she had already made her choice. So, you walked away? Yes, and never checked. His eyes filled. I wrote her once one letter. What happened? I was told it was returned. My heart sank. Who told you? Hayes. There it was again. The same man standing between them. The same name appearing on both sides of the story. I pulled out a copy of my mother's letter. This one was returned, too. Callahan stared at the handwriting. I've never seen that letter. You should have. Yes. He looked down. I should have gone to her house. I should have called. I should have asked questions. I should have done 100 things differently. I wasn't ready to forgive him. Maybe I never would be, but at least he wasn't pretending he had done everything right. What did Hayes want? Callahan hesitated. He knew I was reviewing several procurement contracts. Military contracts? Yes. Were they connected to him indirectly? He explained that several years earlier he had discovered irregularities involving a defense contractor and officers who had financial connections to the company. Hayes had been involved in the review process. Callahan suspected Hayes was protecting someone. But why destroy your relationship with my mother because I was getting too close? So he hired her to protect his career. That is what I believe. I stared at him. That doesn't explain why he kept lying for decades. Callahan leaned back, because once someone builds a lie, they have to keep feeding it. That sentence stayed with me. The next morning, I started digging. I wasn't investigating as a vigilante. I wasn't trying to ruin anyone. I was a Navy servicewoman, and I knew the difference between suspicion and evidence. I began with public records, old newspaper archives, military biographies, and documents my mother had saved. Then I found something. A newspaper article from 1998. It mentioned a procurement investigation that had quietly ended after a senior officer transferred to another command. The officer's name was Richard Hayes. I kept reading. There was a photograph beside the article. Hayes stood beside Thomas Callahan at an official Navy ceremony. The caption described them as trusted colleagues. I almost laughed. Trusted colleagues. I printed the article. Then I found something else. A handwritten note inside one of my mother's old envelopes. I recognized the handwriting immediately. My mother had written, "Richard said Thomas would lose career if I kept contacting him." I stared at that sentence. Then another note beneath it. He said Thomas had already chosen someone else. My hands began to shake. Hayes hadn't simply lied once. He had controlled the story from both sides. He had made my mother believe Thomas didn't want her. He had made Thomas believe my mother didn't want him. And while they both lived with the consequences, he continued building his career. I called. I found something. What? Your former colleague wasn't just involved in the letters. What did you find? Mom wrote that he threatened your career. There was silence. Then Callahan said quietly, I remember that conversation. My heart stopped. What conversation? Hayes warned me that if Margaret kept contacting me, my career could become complicated. You remember? I remember. Then why didn't you tell me? Because I wasn't certain. I closed my eyes. Admiral, we need to find out what really happened. Yes. And if Hayes did this deliberately, Callahan interrupted gently. Ren, what are you planning? I looked at the old photograph on my desk. I don't want revenge. I paused. I want the truth. And for the first time, I understood that those two things were not the same. I spent the next several days reminding myself of one thing. I was not going to become obsessed with revenge. That would have been easy. After discovering that one man might have stolen decades from my mother, my father and me, part of me wanted to see Richard Hayes lose everything. His reputation, his friends, his comfortable retirement, every bit of respect he had earned, while my mother lived with the consequences of his lies. But anger is dangerous when you let it make decisions for you. I had learned that in the Navy. You don't act because you're angry. You gather facts. You document what happened. Then you let the truth speak for itself. So I kept digging. Admiral Callahan helped where he could, but he was careful. He didn't want to use his rank to pressure anyone. If this was going to be resolved, it had to be based on evidence. Then we found someone who could help. Richard Hayes had been married for decades. His wife was named Evelyn. According to public records, they still lived in the same Virginia town where they had raised their children. I wasn't sure what she knew. I wasn't even sure she would speak to us. But when Callahan called her, she agreed to meet. Not at her house, not at a restaurant. She asked us to meet at a small church fellowship hall on a Tuesday afternoon. When Evelyn walked in, she looked like a woman who had spent years carrying a secret she didn't want anymore. She was in her late 60s with silver hair and tired eyes. She looked at Callahan, then at me. You're Margaret's daughter. Yes. She nodded slowly. I thought you might come one day. My heart tightened. You knew about me. I knew there was a child. Did you know I was his daughter? She looked at Callahan. I suspected. Callahan remained silent. I placed copies of the letters on the table. I need to know what Richard did. Evelyn sat down. For several moments she simply stared at the papers. Then she said Richard was afraid of Thomas. Why? Because Thomas was getting close to something. Richard didn't want anyone to find the contracts. She nodded. I don't know all the details. Richard never told me everything, but I knew there was an investigation. Did he interfere with my mother's letters? Evelyn looked down. Yes. My chest tightened. How do you know? Because I saw him do it. Callahan leaned forward. What did you see? Evelyn took a slow breath. He had a stack of envelopes. Some were addressed to Thomas. Some were to Margaret. I felt my hands go cold. What did he do with them? He opened them. Why? He said he was protecting Thomas. I almost laughed. Protecting him? That was the word he used. Evelyn looked at me. He said Margaret was emotional and that Thomas needed to focus on his career. I shook my head. That wasn't his decision to make. No. Did you ever confront him? Not then. Why? She looked away. Because I was afraid too. That answer stayed with me. Fear had been everywhere in this story. My mother had been afraid of destroying Thomas's career. Thomas had been afraid of being unwanted. Evelyn had been afraid of her husband. And Richard Hayes had been afraid of losing his career. One man's fear had multiplied until it became an entire family's tragedy. Evelyn reached into her purse and pulled out a small key. There is something I kept. She placed it on the table. What is it? A box. She looked at Callahan. Richard doesn't know I have it. The box was in her car. Inside were copies of old correspondence notes and one letter Richard had written. I unfolded it carefully. The letter wasn't addressed to my mother. It was addressed to another Navy officer. The handwriting was unmistakable. Richard had written that Callahan needed to be kept away from personal distractions while the procurement investigation was underway. Then came a sentence that made my stomach turn. Margaret Sullivan must not be allowed to contact him directly. I looked at Callahan. His face had gone completely still. You were right, I whispered. He didn't answer. Evelyn began to cry. I should have stopped him. I looked at her. You can't change what happened. I know, but you can tell the truth now. She nodded. I want to. That was when I realized something. The truth wasn't going to come from revenge. It was going to come from people finally becoming brave enough to say what they had seen. Later that evening, Callahan and I sat in his car outside the fellowship hall. He held the copy of Richard's letter. You don't have to do this, he said. Do what? Keep digging. I turned toward him. My mother waited almost 30 years, I know. I spent most of my life thinking my father didn't want me. He looked down. I know. And now you're telling me I can just walk away? No. He paused. I'm telling you that you don't have to carry this alone. For some reason, those words affected me more than anything else he had said. I had spent my entire life thinking I had to be strong, because there was no one else. Now, this man, the father I had never known, was offering to stand beside me. Not as an admiral, not as a stranger, as my father. But I wasn't ready to call him that, not yet. We still need to talk to Hayes, I said. Callahan nodded. I'll go with you. No, he looked surprised. I need to do this myself. Ren? I don't want him hiding behind your rank. Callahan understood. The next afternoon I drove to Richard Hayes's house. He opened the door himself. He was older than I expected. White hair, thin frame, a cane in one hand. For a moment, and I felt something unexpected, not hatred, sadness, because this was the man who had changed 3 lives with a handful of lies. He looked at me. You're Ren? Yes, his face changed. Does Thomas know you're here? He does now. Hayes lowered his eyes. I placed the copies of the letters on the table between us. You told my mother he abandoned her. Silence. You told him she abandoned him. Nothing. You intercepted their letters. His hand tightened around the cane. Finally, he whispered. I was afraid. I stared at him. Of what? Losing everything. I took a breath. You didn't just risk losing your career. I pointed to the letters. You stole a family. Hayes looked at the papers, and for the first time, the man who had controlled everyone else's story had nothing left to say. Richard Hayes kept staring at the letters on his dining room table. For almost a minute, he said nothing. I stood across from him waiting. Finally, he lowered himself into a chair. I never meant for it to go this far, he said. I felt something inside me tighten. Almost 30 years is a long way to go. He nodded. I know. Then tell me exactly what happened. He rubbed his hands together. I was afraid Thomas was going to expose the procurement problems. There were people above me involved. If he kept digging, my career was finished. And my mother, she became leverage. The word made my stomach turn. You used her? Yes. Why? Because I knew he loved her. Hayes looked down. I thought if I convinced him she had rejected him, he would stop looking backward and focus on his career. And you told my mother the same thing about him. Yes. Did you know she was pregnant? His face changed. No, I studied him. You didn't know? No. For some reason, that answer hurt more than I expected. Because it meant the tragedy had been even more ordinary than I imagined. There hadn't been some elaborate plan to steal a child. There had been fear, selfishness, lies, and people making decisions they had no right to make. What happened to the letters? I intercepted some most, and the rest destroyed. My jaw tightened. You destroyed letters between two people who loved each other. Yes. Why? He looked at me. Because by then I was trying to protect the lie. There it was. The sentence I had been waiting for. Once a lie becomes your shield, you start defending it even after you forget why you built it. I stood. I don't want your excuses. I know. I want the truth documented. He nodded. I'll give you everything I have. You'll also tell my mother, his eyes filled with regret. I will. I left his house without shaking his hand. I wasn't ready for that. Outside, I called. He confessed. There was a long silence. Are you all right? No, he didn't try to make me feel better. That mattered. I'll meet you at your mother's. When I arrived, Callahan was already there. He stood on my mother's porch, looking strangely nervous. For the first time, I realized that this decorated admiral, this man who had commanded thousands of sailors, was terrified of one woman. My mother opened the door. She looked at him. He looked at her. Neither moved. Then my mother said quietly, Thomas. He swallowed. Margaret, I stepped aside. I'll be inside. My mother reached for my arm. No, stay. So I stayed. Callahan looked at her. I thought you left me. Her eyes filled with tears. I thought you didn't want me. I never stopped loving you. She looked down. I waited. I know. No, Thomas. You don't know. Her voice trembled. I waited every night. I thought maybe there would be a phone call, a letter, anything. I wrote. I never received them. I know that now. She looked at him. Why didn't you come? He took a breath. Because I believed you didn't want me. My mother's face crumpled. I was 26. So was I. We were young. Yes. And scared. Yes, she laughed through her tears. We let other people decide our lives. Callahan nodded. I should have fought harder. You should have. He didn't argue. I should have come looking for you. Yes, I should have found you. Yes, and I should have known there was a child. My mother looked at me. You didn't know. I would have come. I believe you. That was the first moment I saw something change between them. Not forgiveness. Not yet. Something smaller. The possibility of forgiveness. Ren. I'm sorry. I crossed my arms. You didn't know I existed. No, but once you knew I wanted to find you. You could have. Yes. I expected anger. Instead, I felt tears in my eyes. I spent years thinking there was something wrong with me. His face broke. There was never anything wrong with you. I thought my father didn't want me. He shook his head. I would have wanted every minute. I looked away. For years, I had imagined meeting my father. I had imagined anger, accusations, maybe even walking away. I had never imagined standing in my mother's kitchen, with tears running down my face while a 4-star admiral apologized for a childhood he hadn't known he had taken from me. He didn't ask me to call him Dad. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He simply said, if you ever want to know me, I'll be here. That was enough. Over the next few weeks, the evidence was formally documented and turned over to the appropriate authorities and Navy channels for review. Richard Hayes could no longer hide behind his retirement or his reputation. But something surprised me. Seeing consequences finally reach him didn't feel like victory. It felt like closure. My mother and Callahan began talking again slowly, carefully. They didn't pretend 30 years had disappeared. They didn't suddenly become young again. They simply started having coffee together. Sometimes they argued. Sometimes they laughed. Sometimes they sat in silence. One evening, I noticed them sitting on the porch. My mother reached for Callahan's hand, his sleeve pulled back slightly. I saw the tattoo, the old compass, the needle pointing toward the Big Dipper. My mother noticed it too. She smiled. I never changed mine. Callahan rolled back his own sleeve. Neither did I. I looked at their wrists. 2 identical tattoos. 2 people who had spent decades believing they had lost each other. And suddenly I understood something. The tattoo had never been a promise that life would be easy. It was a reminder that people can lose their way. What matters is whether they have the courage to find their way back. I had spent weeks thinking about revenge. But standing there, watching my mother and the father I had just discovered, I realized something I hadn't expected. The best ending wasn't watching Richard Hayes suffer. It was watching his lies finally lose their power. He had taken years from us, but he couldn't take the years we still had left. I looked at Callahan. He smiled. Dinner next Sunday. Sunday. I hesitated, then I smiled back. Okay. It was only one word, but for me, it was the beginning of something I had never thought I'd have. A father. For a long time, I thought justice would feel different. I thought there would be a moment when Richard Hayes finally faced what he had done, and I would feel some great weight lift from my chest. But when the truth was documented and his actions were finally brought into the proper channels for review, I didn't feel victorious. I felt tired. Not the kind of tired that comes from a long day at work. The kind that settles into your bones after carrying the same unanswered question for most of your life. Why didn't my father want me? Why did my mother wait? Why did two people who loved each other spend decades believing they had been rejected? And why had I needed to discover a tattoo at an airport to finally learn the truth? There were no easy answers. Richard Hayes eventually faced the consequences of what he had done. His reputation could no longer protect him from the facts. People who had once trusted him had to confront what he had hidden. But I never celebrated it. That surprised me. For weeks, I had imagined standing over him and finally saying, "You deserve this." Instead, when I heard that his actions were being formally reviewed, I simply closed my eyes. I thought about my mother. I thought about the little girl I had been. And I thought about the man I had spent years believing didn't want me. That was when I realized something important. Justice wasn't about making Hayes feel the pain he had caused. Justice was about making sure the truth could no longer be buried. A few months passed. My mother's relationship with Thomas changed slowly. They didn't pretend they could erase 30 years. They couldn't. There were birthdays missed, holidays spent apart, family photographs that would never exist, childhood memories Thomas could never recover. There were things I couldn't tell him because I didn't remember them. There were stories my mother had stopped telling because they hurt too much. But they began building something new. Not the life they had lost, a different life. One afternoon, I found the two of them sitting on my mother's porch. Thomas was holding 2 cups of coffee. My mother was reading the newspaper. "You're early," she said when she saw me. "I came to check on you." Thomas smiled. "You always check on people. Occupational hazard." He laughed. I sat beside them. For a while, none of us spoke. Then Thomas asked, "Do you remember the first time you saw the tattoo at the airport?" "Yes. I remember thinking you looked like you had seen a ghost." He smiled faintly. I thought I had. I looked at his wrist. "Do you ever regret getting it?" He shook his head. "Never. Even after everything, especially after everything." My mother reached for his hand. I watched their fingers slowly intertwine. The compass tattoo was visible beneath his sleeve. The needle pointed toward the Big Dipper. My mother noticed me looking at it. "You know what it means now?" I nodded. "Finding your way home," she smiled. "That's what we called it." Thomas looked at her, and I meant it. I looked down at my own hands. For most of my life, I had thought family was something you were either given or denied. I had believed mine was broken before I was old enough to understand what broken meant. But now I understood something different. Families can be damaged. People can make terrible mistakes. Years can disappear. And still sometimes people can choose what to do with the time they have left. One Sunday, Thomas invited me to his home for dinner. I almost said no. Not because I didn't want to go. Because I was nervous. I had spent my entire adult life being independent. Now, I was learning how to be someone's daughter. That was harder than I expected. We sat around his dining room table. He had cooked too much food. I laughed when I saw it. "Did you make enough for the entire squadron?" He smiled. "Your mother told me you like leftovers." "She did. She's been giving me instructions." I laughed. It felt strangely normal. After dinner, Thomas brought out an old photograph. It was the same photograph my mother had shown me. He was young. She was young. Both of them smiling. On the back were the words, Find Your Way Home. He handed it to me. I want you to have this. I looked at him. Are you sure? Yes. I turned the photograph over again. There was something peaceful about holding it now. The picture no longer represented a life that had been stolen from me. It represented a truth that had finally found its way back. I put the photograph in my wallet. Thank you. He nodded. Then he said something I will never forget. I can't give you back the years I missed. I looked at him, but I can make sure I don't miss the ones ahead. That was when I finally allowed myself to say the word. Dad. His eyes filled with tears. He looked down for a moment, trying to compose himself. Then he smiled. Yeah, nothing. He laughed softly, and somehow that was enough. My mother and Thomas never tried to recreate their youth. They simply chose to stop letting the past decide the future. As for me, I carried one lesson forward. I used to think revenge meant making someone feel the pain they had caused. I was wrong. Sometimes the strongest form of justice is refusing to let another person's lie determine who you become. The truth doesn't always arrive on time. Sometimes it comes after years of silence. Sometimes it arrives in a faded letter. Sometimes it appears on the wrist of a stranger at an airport. But when it finally comes, you have a choice. You can use it to destroy, or you can use it to heal. I chose healing. My mother chose forgiveness without forgetting. Thomas chose to make up for lost time. And even though none of us could change what happened, we could decide what happened next. That old compass tattoo taught me something I will carry for the rest of my life. A compass doesn't promise that you will never get lost. It simply reminds you that you can always choose a direction. And sometimes after years of wandering the direction you need, most is home. If this story touched something in your own life, take a moment to think about the people you may have misunderstood, the words you may have left unsaid, or the relationships that might still be worth repairing. And if you believe that truth, forgiveness, and second chances still matter, share this story with someone who may need that reminder. To Stuber for more stories about courage, family justice, and the unexpected ways life gives us a second chance. Because sometimes the greatest victory isn't revenge. Sometimes it's finding your way. Arthur told me you would come. The old man stood beside a battered pickup at the mountain overlook, staring at me as if he had been waiting for years. I had never seen him before, yet he knew my grandfather's name. And somehow that scared me, more than the inheritance hearing that had happened that morning. My name is Ethan Carter, and by noon, everyone in my family believed I had been given the worst inheritance of all. My billionaire grandfather had left millions to almost everyone. My father received a substantial investment portfolio. My older brother Daniel received several properties and a generous trust. My cousins received stock cash and pieces of businesses they had never worked for. Then the estate attorney looked down at his papers and said, "My name. Ethan Carter is to receive the 2012 Ford Explorer currently registered in the estate." For a few seconds, nobody moved. Then my brother laughed. Not a nervous laugh, a real laugh. My father smiled too. The kind of smile a man wears when something has gone exactly the way he expected. Daniel leaned toward me. "Seriously?" I looked at the attorney. "That's it." The attorney nodded. "The vehicle is yours free and clear." I looked around the conference room. Nobody seemed shocked. They looked relieved, amused, or quietly satisfied. For a moment, I wondered whether I had somehow misunderstood the entire will. My father cleared his throat. "Your grandfather always had an unusual sense of humor." A few relatives chuckled. I didn't. I simply reached for the keys. That was when Daniel laughed again. "You got a used car while the rest of us got millions." I looked at him. I guess Grandpa knew what he was doing. The room went quiet. Daniel's smile disappeared for half a second. Then my father patted my shoulder. "Don't take it personally, Ethan." I didn't answer. The estate attorney handed me a folder containing the title and registration. Before I left, he added something that made me pause. "There is one more instruction concerning the vehicle." I turned around. "What kind your grandfather specifically ordered that nothing inside the vehicle be removed before you received it?" I frowned. "Nothing. Nothing." My father suddenly looked interested. "Arthur put instructions about a car." The attorney nodded. "Yes." My father's expression changed so quickly that I almost missed it. Almost. I drove the Explorer home that afternoon. It was old, but not falling apart. The seats were worn. There was a faded coffee stain near the center console, and a cracked plastic cup holder. It smelled faintly of leather dust, and the pene-scented air freshener people used when they were trying to make an old car feel newer than it was. I opened the glove compartment, insurance papers, an owner's manual, a tire pressure gauge, nothing. I checked beneath the seats, nothing. I was about to close the driver's door when I noticed the GPS. It was an older built-in navigation system. I turned it on. There was only one saved destination, home. I stared at the screen. Home. I assumed the previous owner had forgotten to erase it, but then I remembered the attorney's warning. Nothing inside the vehicle was supposed to be removed. Curiosity got the better of me. I pressed the destination. The route appeared. It was a long drive west away from the city and toward the Appalachian foothills. I almost turned it off. Instead, I started the engine. For the next 3 hours, I drove through familiar American highways and then increasingly quiet roads. The suburbs gave way to farmland. Gas stations became fewer. Cell service weakened. I kept thinking about the inheritance hearing, about Daniel laughing, about my father smiling, and about the strange look on his face when the attorney mentioned the car. As evening approached, the GPS directed me onto a narrow mountain road. I followed it until the pavement ended at a gravel overlook. There were no houses nearby, no businesses, just trees, mountains, and a wide view of the valley below. I turned off the engine, then I saw him. An elderly man stood beside an old pickup truck near the railing. He was wearing a faded denim jacket and work boots. He looked at my Explorer, then at me. He didn't seem surprised. He walked slowly toward my driver's window. I lowered it. "Can I help you?" He studied my face. "You're Ethan." My stomach tightened. "How do you know my name?" He didn't answer as immediately. Instead, he looked toward the passenger seat. "Did Arthur leave you the car?" I nodded. The old man exhaled, then he kept his promise. I stepped out. "Who are you?" "My name is Samuel Reed." He held out his hand. I shook it. His grip was stronger than I expected. "Your grandfather told me something," he said. "What?" Samuel looked directly into my eyes. "He told me that if you ever came here, you would probably be angry." I almost laughed. "Angry at your family, at him, maybe even at yourself." I looked back at the Explorer. "You know what happened today?" "I know exactly what happened." My throat tightened. "Then tell me why he gave me a used car." Samuel glanced toward the mountains. "Because the car isn't what he left you." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small brass key. I stared at it. "What does that open?" Samuel closed his fingers around the key. "That's what you're going to find out." He looked at me for another moment. "But before you do, Ethan, you need to understand something." "What?" "Your grandfather didn't trust the people who inherited his money." I felt a chill move through me. Then who did he trust? Samuel looked at me. "You." For the first time that day, I had no answer. And somewhere beneath the floor of that old SUV, I suddenly realized there might be a reason my grandfather had made sure I received nothing that looked valuable. I just didn't know how much it was going to cost me to learn why. Samuel didn't hand me the brass key. He simply held it between us, letting me look at it. "Why would my grandpa leave something like this in a car?" I asked. "Because he didn't want anyone else finding it." "Who?" Samuel looked toward the road behind me. "Your father." That answer landed harder than I expected. I had spent my entire life trying to understand why my father treated me differently from my brother. Robert Carter had never been openly cruel. That would have been easier. Instead, he had been polite, controlled, distant. Whenever Daniel succeeded, Dad celebrated. Whenever I succeeded, Dad nodded and changed the subject. I had stopped expecting his approval years ago. But hearing Samuel say his name at that mountain overlook made all those old moments suddenly feel different. Why wouldn't Grandpa trust my father? Samuel finally placed the brass key in my palm. "Because Arthur knew your father better than you did." I closed my fingers around it. "Then tell me what happened." Samuel shook his head. "Not here." He pointed toward the Explorer. "There's something inside that car you need to see first." We walked back to the vehicle. Samuel opened the rear hatch and knelt beside the cargo floor. He ran his fingers along the edge of the carpet. "There." I looked closely. At first I saw nothing. Then I noticed a tiny metal latch hidden beneath the carpet. I pulled it. The floor lifted. Underneath was a shallow compartment. Inside sat a small black metal box. I stared at it. How did you know that was there? Because I helped your grandfather put it there. My heart started beating faster. The brass key fit the lock perfectly. Inside were 4 things: an old photograph, a folded property deed, a handwritten letter, and a small envelope with my name on it, Ethan. My hand suddenly felt unsteady. I picked up the photograph first. It showed my grandfather as a much younger man standing beside Samuel, in front of what looked like an unfinished construction site. Arthur was smiling. Samuel wasn't. On the back, someone had written a date from more than 30 years earlier. I unfolded the letter. The handwriting was unmistakably Arthur's. Ethan, if you're reading, then you probably believe I left you almost nothing. I stopped. Samuel watched me quietly. I continued. That is exactly what I wanted you to believe. I swallowed. My grandfather explained that he had spent his final years watching his family change. As his fortune grew, people who had once visited him because they loved him began visiting because they wanted something. He wrote that he wasn't disappointed by the money itself. He was disappointed by what money revealed. Then came the sentence that made me sit down on the tailgate. I have reason to believe that someone close to me has been moving money out of the company without my permission. I looked at Samuel. He nodded. Keep reading. Arthur wrote that he had hired private investigators and forensic accountants without telling the family. The investigation had uncovered suspicious payments made through consulting companies. Millions of dollars had disappeared over several years. The names weren't directly connected to the family, but the people receiving the money were. I felt my stomach tighten. Does this involve my father? Samuel didn't answer. I looked back at the letter. Arthur wrote that he had deliberately kept Ethan away from the family business because he believed Ethan was the only person who hadn't become dependent on the family fortune. Your father believes money is power. Your brother believes money is proof that he matters. I want you to understand that money is only a tool. I stared at those words for a long moment. Then I reached for the envelope. Inside was another note. This one was shorter. Do not confront your father. Do not tell Daniel what you found. Take the deed to my attorney, then ask him about the Carter Family Trust. I looked up. What's the Carter Family Trust? Samuel sighed. Something your grandfather created before he died. Why didn't anyone mention it today? Because they don't know everything. That surprised me. You're telling me my family just divided millions of dollars. And there's another trust nobody knows about. Your grandfather planned it that way. I looked at the property deed. The name on it wasn't a person. It was a mountain property, the same area where we were standing. Why does he own this place? Samuel smiled faintly. He didn't. I looked at him. What? He bought the land decades ago. Then he transferred it to who? To a trust. I felt like I was standing in the middle of a puzzle where every answer created 3 more questions. Samuel finally told me the story. 35 years earlier, Arthur had been struggling to keep his small construction company alive. Banks wouldn't lend him enough money. Investors wanted control. Samuel had taken a chance on him. They made an agreement at that very overlook. Samuel would help Arthur secure his first major contract. Arthur promised that if the company ever became successful, he would never forget the people who helped him build it. He kept that promise, Samuel said. Then why involve me? Because your grandfather knew the company had become something he no longer recognized. I thought about the inheritance hearing. Millions distributed to people who barely understood how the company had been built, and me a used SUV, a brass key, a mountain road, and a warning. My phone vibrated. I pulled it from my pocket. A text message from my father. Where are you? A second message arrived before I could answer. The attorney said, You left with the car. Call me. Then another. This isn't something you should investigate on your own. I stared at the screen. Samuel noticed my expression. That's him. I nodded. Does he know where you are? No. Samuel's face became serious. Then don't tell him. I put the phone away. For the first time in my life, I realized that keeping something from my father might actually be necessary. I drove home later that night, with the black box hidden beneath my spare tire. When I reached my driveway, my father's black Mercedes was parked across the street. He was waiting. I stopped the Explorer. Dad stepped out. He looked at the old SUV, then at me. What did you find? I kept my face calm. Nothing. He stared at me. You drove 3 hours into the mountains. I wanted to see where the GPS went. Why curiosity? My father gave a small smile. It wasn't the same smile from the inheritance hearing. This one was nervous. Ethan, your grandfather was sick near the end. He wasn't thinking clearly. I looked at him. Maybe. Dad stepped closer. Whatever he told you, whatever you think you found, let it go. I said nothing. He lowered his voice. Some things are better left alone. Then he walked back toward his Mercedes. I watched him leave. For years, I had believed my father didn't care enough about me to pay attention. Now, I understood something far more frightening. He had been paying attention all along. I went inside, locked the door, and placed Arthur's letter on the kitchen table. Then, I opened my laptop. I searched the public records for the Carter Family Trust. The first result made my breath catch. The trust wasn't empty, it wasn't small, and according to the filing, I was the only individual beneficiary named in a sealed provision. I leaned back in my chair. My grandfather hadn't left me a used car because I was worth less than everyone else. He had left me the one thing my family would never think to steal from me until they knew what it was. A secret. And suddenly, I understood why he had trusted me with it. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the words on Arthur's letter. Do not confront your father. Do not tell Daniel what you found. The next morning, I called the estate attorney, Margaret Collins. She answered on the second ring. Ethan, yes. I found the documents. There was a pause. Then you found what Arthur wanted you to find. There's something I need to know. What exactly is the Carter Family Trust? I can't discuss the trust over the phone. Come to my office. I arrived early. Margaret closed her office door and placed a thick file on the desk. Your grandfather anticipated that you'd have questions. Did he know my father was stealing from the company? Margaret didn't answer immediately. We have evidence suggesting unauthorized transfers, but until the forensic review is complete, I won't call it theft. I appreciated her caution. Who was receiving the money? She opened the file. Several consulting companies. On paper, they were legitimate. In reality, their ownership structures were deliberately complicated. She slid a page toward me. I recognized one name immediately. My father's longtime business advisor. Another company was connected to Daniel. I stared at them. How much? Approximately $18 million over 7 years. $18 million, that's what we've identified so far. I leaned back. Why didn't Grandpa expose them? Because he wanted evidence strong enough to survive court. Margaret explained that Arthur had suspected financial misconduct, but refused to make accusations based on suspicion. He had hired an independent forensic accountant and quietly moved certain assets away from family control. Then she told me something that changed everything. Arthur also knew someone was monitoring his communications. I looked at her. Who we don't know, but he suspected my father. Yes. I thought about Dad appearing outside my house asking what I found. Margaret opened another folder. This is your grandfather's personal memorandum. I read the first line. If Ethan is reading this, the family has already begun asking what he received. I smiled. Arthur knew them too well. The memorandum explained why Ethan's inheritance looked insignificant. Arthur had intentionally separated the visible inheritance from the assets that mattered. The Explorer had been transferred to me because it was one of the few things nobody would fight over. Nobody would search it, nobody would suspect it, and nobody would imagine that a used vehicle contained the first clue to a financial investigation. But there was another reason. Arthur wrote that he wanted to know how the family would treat me when they believed I had received nothing, because it was true. I remembered Daniel laughing, my father's smile, the relatives who suddenly stopped making eye contact. Arthur had created a test, and my family had failed it before lunch. Margaret looked at me. There's more. She handed me a sealed document. This becomes active only under specific conditions. I opened it. The Carter Family Trust contained assets worth considerably more than I expected, but I couldn't access them immediately. There were conditions. I had to remain independent of the family business. I had to maintain complete financial records, and most importantly, I had to appoint an independent trustee if there was ever a conflict involving my immediate family. Arthur had thought of everything. I looked up. Why me? Margaret smiled gently. because your grandfather believed you were the least interested in his money." That sentence stayed with me. I left with copies and drove to a forensic accounting firm. For the next 2 weeks, I kept working and paying my bills, while reviewing transaction records with the accountant at night. Patterns began to emerge. Payments were split into smaller amounts. Invoices were duplicated. Consulting fees were approved by people who benefited from them. My father had built a system. Daniel wasn't innocent either. He had received money through one of the companies. Then we found something worse. A transfer had been made shortly before Arthur's final hospitalization. It was large enough to trigger additional scrutiny. The recipient was a company controlled by Daniel. I stared at the screen. "Did Grandpa know about this?" The accountant nodded. "That's probably why he accelerated the trust." I sat silently. Then I remembered something from childhood. My mother had once argued with Dad in the kitchen. I had been 12. She thought I was asleep. "You're becoming someone your father would have hated," she told him. Dad had slammed a cabinet door. "You don't understand what it takes to protect a family." At the time, I thought they were arguing about work. Now, I wasn't so sure. I searched my mother's old belongings. In a box of photographs, I found a notebook. Most of it contained grocery lists and ordinary family notes. Near the back were several handwritten pages. My mother's handwriting. She had written dates, company names, amounts, and one sentence: "Arthur is right. Something is happening with the money, but Robert says I'm imagining things." I put the notebook down. My mother had known. Maybe not everything, but enough to be afraid. I sat there until midnight. Then my phone buzzed. A message from Daniel. "Dad knows you're digging." Another message appeared. "You should stop before you embarrass yourself." I stared at the screen. For years, those words would have hurt. This time they didn't. I opened the file containing the financial records. Then I opened the photograph of my grandfather and Samuel at the mountain overlook. I understood what Arthur had wanted. He wasn't asking me to destroy my family. He was asking me to stop them from destroying themselves. I typed one reply to Daniel. "I'm not digging for revenge." I paused, then added, "I'm looking for the truth." I put the phone down. A minute later it buzzed again. Daniel had replied, "You have no idea who you're fighting." I looked at those words. Then, for the first time since the hearing, I smiled. They still think I'm the fool, and that was their biggest mistake. The next morning, I made a decision that surprised even me. I wasn't going to confront my father. I wasn't going to confront Daniel, and I wasn't going to tell anyone in the family what Arthur had left me. For the first time in my life, I was going to let the truth speak for itself. I called Margaret and asked her to begin the formal process with the forensic accountants. "Are you sure?" she asked. "Yes, once we do this, Ethan, there won't be a way to put everything back the way it was." I looked at Arthur's letter sitting on my desk. I don't think it was ever the way my grandfather wanted it to be. That afternoon, the independent audit began. The family business had been operating for decades. It had hundreds of employees, contracts across several states, and accountants who handled numbers far more complicated than anything I had ever dealt with. But fraud doesn't become invisible just because a company is large. It leaves patterns. And once someone knows where to look, those patterns become difficult to hide. The accountants followed the money. Payments had been divided between several consulting companies. Some invoices described services that had never been performed. Others listed vague business development expenses that were impossible to verify. Then they found something that connected everything. One of the shell companies was registered to a mailing address in Delaware. The address belonged to a law firm, but the beneficial owner was hidden behind another company. That company was connected to Daniel's investment account. I stared at the documents, so Daniel knew. Margaret nodded. "We can't know exactly what he knew yet, but the financial connection is significant." And my father, "We found transactions connected to an account controlled by an advisor who has worked with your father for more than 20 years. I closed my eyes. The evidence was becoming impossible to dismiss. Then my phone rang. It was Daniel. I almost didn't answer. Finally I did. "What?" His voice was unusually calm. "We need to talk about what you know." "I don't," he exhaled. "Ethan, Dad is willing to make this worth your while." I leaned back. "What does that mean?" It means you walk away. You stop cooperating with the accountants, and Dad will give you $5 million. For a moment, I said nothing. $5 million, a number that could change someone's life, a number my family apparently believed would change mine enough to make me disappear. I thought about the inheritance hearing, the laughter, the used car. Then I remembered Arthur's words. Money is only a tool. No. Daniel's voice hardened. You're making a mistake. I don't think so. You have no idea what you're getting into. I know exactly what I'm getting into. No, you don't. He paused. Then he said something that revealed more than he intended. Grandpa wasn't as innocent as you think. My hand tightened around the phone. What does that mean? Ask yourself why he didn't tell you any of this while he was alive. Maybe he was waiting for me to find out myself. Daniel laughed bitterly. You really believe he chose you because you're special? I didn't answer. Ethan, you were always the one who stayed outside the family business. You think that makes you better than us? No, then stop acting like it. The call ended. I sat there staring at the phone. For years, I had believed Daniel's arrogance came from insecurity. Now I understood it came from fear. He was afraid of losing something, not money, control. The next day, I met with Margaret again. She told me the audit had uncovered enough evidence to warrant formal legal action. We're turning everything over, I nodded. Do it. Within weeks, the atmosphere inside the Carter organization changed. Executives who had once answered my father's calls immediately stopped returning them. Bank representatives requested documentation. Outside counsel began reviewing contracts. The board ordered a deeper investigation, and then the news reached the family. Relatives who had laughed at me began calling. My cousin Rachel was the first. Ethan, I'm so sorry. For what? For what happened at the inheritance hearing? I almost smiled. It's okay. No, it isn't. We all thought you got nothing. You weren't the only one. She hesitated. Do you know what Arthur actually left you? I looked out the window. Yes. Are you going to tell everyone no why? Because that's exactly what everyone cared about. She didn't have an answer. Then came the other calls. An uncle wanted advice. A cousin wanted reassurance. Someone I hadn't spoken to in years asked if I could help protect their inheritance. I realized something painful. The moment people believed I might have money, they suddenly remembered that I was family. I refused every request, not because I wanted them to suffer, because I needed them to understand that relationships couldn't be bought back with the same currency that had destroyed them. One evening, I found Daniel standing outside my house. He looked different. No expensive suit, no confident smile, just a tired man standing beneath the porch light. I need to talk to you. I opened the door but didn't invite him inside about what he looked down. Dad, I waited. He's scared, so am I. Daniel looked at me. You shouldn't be. Why? Because Grandpa planned all of this. I said nothing. Daniel continued. He knew Dad was moving money. That was the first time Daniel had admitted it directly. How long? Daniel swallowed. Years. I felt something inside me go cold. And you? He looked away. I took some. How much? He didn't answer. I didn't need him to. The investigation would tell us. Daniel looked back at me. Ethan, I know I laughed at you. Yes, I know what I said. Yes. And I know I treated you like you were nothing. I stared at him. What do you want from me? Nothing. That surprised me. I just wanted you to know that I was wrong. Before I could respond, Daniel turned and walked away. I watched him disappear into the darkness. For the first time, I realized revenge wasn't going to feel the way I had imagined. I had spent years imagining the day my family would finally understand my worth. But now that day had arrived, and there was no satisfaction in watching people fall apart. There was only sadness. The following week, the investigation confirmed what Arthur had feared. Millions had been diverted. My father had approved suspicious transactions. Daniel had benefited from them, and both had helped conceal the financial trail. But there was one more revelation waiting for me. Margaret called me into her office. She placed a document on the desk. This is the final provision of Arthur's trust. I read it, then I read it again. My grandfather hadn't simply protected money for me. He had created a charitable trust under my control. Veterans, working families, emergency assistants, scholarships. People who had the same problem my grandfather had once faced before he became wealthy. People who needed opportunity more than inheritance. I looked at Margaret. He wanted me to do this. He wanted you to decide whether you were willing to carry the responsibility. I thought about the old SUV, the mountain, Samuel, the key, and the family that had laughed because they thought I had received nothing. For the first time, I understood the real revenge. It wasn't making them poor. It wasn't humiliating them. It was proving that the person they considered worthless could become the one person capable of preserving what Arthur had spent his life building. And then my father came to my door. He wasn't smiling anymore. "Ethan," he said quietly, "I need to tell you the truth." My father stood on my porch for nearly a minute before saying another word. He looked older than he had a month earlier. The confidence was gone, so was the polished expression he wore whenever money or business was involved. "I need to tell you the truth," he said. I stepped aside. "Come in." He entered slowly and sat at the kitchen table. For years, I had wanted my father to sit across from me like this, not as the head of the Carter family, not as the man everyone respected, but simply as my father. Now that it was finally happening, I wasn't sure I wanted to hear what he had to say. He stared at his hands. I waited. I knew money was being moved out of the company. My chest tightened. "How long? Several years. Did Grandpa know?" "Yes," I looked away. "Then why didn't he stop you?" My father shook his head. He tried. The room became silent. Dad explained that when Arthur started asking questions, he initially thought his father was simply becoming suspicious with age. But then Arthur hired outside investigators. Robert panicked. Not because he had personally created every transaction he claimed, but because he had allowed Daniel and several executives to use company money improperly. I told myself I was protecting the family. Dad said. I looked at him. By stealing from the family, he flinched. "I know how it sounds. It sounds exactly like what happened." He nodded. I was afraid. That answer surprised me. My father had always seemed afraid of nothing. "What were you afraid of?" "That I would never be enough." He looked toward the window. "Your grandfather built everything. Every room we lived in, every vacation, every opportunity. People compared me to him my entire life. And Daniel. I made the same mistake with him that my father made with me." I frowned. What mistake? I taught him that money was proof of worth. Dad's voice cracked slightly. "When you were young, you didn't care about any of that. You wanted to work with your hands. You liked fixing things. You could spend an entire afternoon repairing an old motorcycle and never ask how much it was worth." He gave a sad smile. I should have been proud. "But you weren't." I was afraid. I looked at him. "Afraid of me. Afraid that Arthur would respect you more than he respected me." That confession hurt more than I expected. I had spent years thinking my father simply didn't see me. The truth was worse. He saw me. He just saw me as a threat to his own insecurity. "Why did you let Daniel laugh at me?" Dad lowered his head. "Because I was relieved when you weren't interested in the money." I stared at him. He continued. "I thought if you stayed away from the business, you couldn't expose what was happening." I stood and walked toward the window. Outside, the street looked completely ordinary. A neighbor was walking a dog. A delivery truck stopped at a house. Children were riding bicycles. Nobody looking at that quiet neighborhood would have guessed that one family was falling apart over millions of dollars. "What happens now?" I asked. Dad sighed. "I'll have to face the consequences." That isn't an answer. "No," he looked at me. "I don't expect you to protect me." I turned around. "Good." He nodded. "I also don't expect forgiveness." I didn't respond because I didn't know if I could forgive him. Not yet. The investigation continued. The accountants recovered several million through frozen accounts and improperly transferred assets. Other money was harder to trace. My father cooperated after realizing the evidence was overwhelming. Daniel did too eventually. Neither cooperation erased what they had done. There were legal consequences, financial consequences, and consequences inside the family that money couldn't repair. But something else happened. For the first time, my father stopped trying to control the outcome. He stopped calling relatives, stopped pressuring attorneys, stopped trying to convince everyone that he had been misunderstood. He simply accepted responsibility. That mattered to me, not enough to erase the past, but enough to leave a door open. A few weeks later, I drove the old Explorer back to the mountain overlook. Samuel was there. He was sitting on the hood of his pickup, drinking coffee from a metal thermos. You look different, he said. I feel different. He handed me a cup. I sat beside him, my father confessed. Samuel nodded. Arthur expected that. He expected everything. Samuel smiled. That was Arthur. I pulled the final letter from my jacket. I found something else in the trust documents. What Arthur created a charitable fund. Samuel looked at me. For veterans, working families, scholarships, emergency assistance. Samuel smiled. He wanted you to understand where the money came from. What do you mean Arthur never forgot what it felt like to need help? Samuel looked out over the valley. When he started his first company, he had almost nothing. People gave him opportunities. He believed the right thing to do was pass that opportunity forward. I looked at the mountains. I thought my inheritance was a punishment. Samuel chuckled. That was the point. I smiled. Then he said something I'll never forget. Your grandfather didn't trust you with money, Ethan. I looked at him. He trusted you with what money could become. For the first time since the inheritance hearing, I felt the weight in my chest begin to lift. I finally understood. Arthur hadn't wanted me to win against my family. He wanted me to win against the temptation to become like them. A few days later, Daniel called. I want to apologize. I sat quietly while he spoke. I laughed at you. Yes, I thought you were beneath me. Yes, I was wrong. I could hear the shame in his voice. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't know if I can yet, I understand. We stayed silent. Then I said, but I don't want us to spend the rest of our lives hating each other. Daniel took a breath. Neither do I. It wasn't a perfect reconciliation. There were no hugs, no dramatic promises. Just two brothers admitting that something had gone terribly wrong and deciding not to make it worse. That was enough for one day. My father eventually began rebuilding his life outside the family business. Daniel sold several unnecessary properties and began repaying what he could. And I started the charitable trust. I helped fund veteran housing program, scholarships, and emergency grants for working families. The first time I signed a grant check, I thought about the used Explorer sitting in my driveway, a car worth a fraction of what everyone else had received. Yet that car had taken me to the truth. It had taken me to Samuel. It had taken me to Arthur's final lesson. And it had taken me back to myself. Months later, I drove the Explorer to the mountain again. I parked beside the overlook and looked at the valley below. For years, I had thought wealth meant having more than everyone else. Or further taught me something different. Wealth could mean having enough courage to tell the truth, enough wisdom to walk away from greed, enough humility to forgive without forgetting, and enough compassion to use what you have to help someone else stand back up. I finally understood why my grandfather gave me the inheritance nobody wanted. The used car wasn't worthless. It was a roadmap, and I had finally learned how to follow it. The first time I took the Explorer to my father's house after everything was over, I almost turned around. For years, that house had represented everything I thought I had failed to become. My father had built his life around appearances. The right neighborhood, the right car, the right business connections, the right son. And for most of my childhood, I thought that son was Daniel. But that afternoon, something had changed. My father was standing on the front porch when I pulled into the driveway. He looked at the old Explorer and smiled faintly. I still can't believe Arthur left you that thing. I laughed. Neither can I. Dad walked toward the vehicle. Does it still run better than most people in this family? He laughed. It was the first time we'd laughed together in years. We stood beside the Explorer for a moment without saying anything. Then Dad looked at me. I owe you an apology. I didn't answer immediately. I've apologized before, he continued, but I don't think I ever actually told you what I'm sorry for. I waited. I spent years making you feel like you weren't enough. His voice became quieter. I compared you to Daniel. I compared you to Arthur. I compared you to every successful person I knew. And I made you believe that if you weren't wealthy, powerful, or impressive, you didn't matter. I looked down. He was right. There were birthdays when Daniel received expensive gifts and I received a handshake. There were family dinners where Daniel's business stories lasted an hour while my work was barely mentioned. There were moments when I wanted my father's approval so badly that I changed parts of myself just to earn it. Eventually, I stopped trying. I should have told you I was proud of you, Dad said. I looked at him. Why didn't you? He swallowed. Because I was jealous, that word hung between us. Not anger, not greed, jealousy. It was the one thing my father had never admitted. I was jealous. Because Arthur trusted you. I looked toward the mountains in the distance. I didn't know that he did. Dad smiled sadly. Your grandfather used to tell me that you were the one person in the family who didn't need him. I felt something tighten in my chest. He said that more than once. I shook my head. I wish I'd known. So do I. We stood there quietly. Then Dad said, I know forgiveness doesn't happen because I ask for it. No, I know. But it can happen because you change. He nodded. I am trying. That was all I needed to hear. Not a promise that everything would be perfect. Just an admission that change required work. Later that week, Daniel came to see me. He looked uncomfortable standing in my doorway. I brought something. He handed me a small cardboard box. Inside was an old family photograph. Arthur stood in the center. My father was beside him. Daniel was a little boy, and I was maybe 6 years old standing near my grandfather's leg. I turned the photograph over. There was handwriting on the back. The boys will understand someday. I stared at it. Grandpa wrote this. Daniel nodded. I found it in Dad's desk. I smiled sadly. Maybe he knew. He usually did. Daniel sat down for a while. Neither of us spoke. Then he said, I'm sorry. I looked at him. I know. No, Ethan. I really am. He looked down at his hands. I spent my entire life thinking I had to beat you. You didn't. I know that now. He laughed quietly. That's the stupid part. You weren't even competing with me. No, I was competing with a version of you that existed in my head. That was probably the most honest thing my brother had ever said to me. I didn't forgive him instantly. Real forgiveness doesn't work that way. But I decided I didn't want anger to become another inheritance. We agreed to stay in contact slowly, carefully, one conversation at a time. Some things would never return to the way they had been. Maybe that was okay. Some families don't need to go backward. They need to move forward differently. By then, the Carter Charitable Trust was operating. The first scholarships went to students whose parents worked hourly jobs. The first emergency grants helped families pay medical bills and rent after unexpected layoffs. We also partnered with organizations supporting veterans transitioning into civilian life. I signed every approval personally, not because I wanted control, because I wanted to remember what Arthur had taught me. Money wasn't the destination, it was the vehicle. And suddenly, the old explorer sitting outside my office seemed almost funny. A billionaire had given his grandson a used car, and somehow that car had carried more meaning than millions of dollars. One Saturday morning, I drove back to the mountain overlook. Samuel was waiting. He was older than he looked when I first met him, but there was still strength in his posture. You came back, he said. I wanted to say thank you. He waved me off. Thank your grandfather. I already did. Samuel smiled. We stood beside the railing. The valley below was covered in golden morning light. I thought about the day I had arrived there, angry and confused. I thought I had been cheated. I thought everyone else had won. I thought my grandfather had chosen me last. I couldn't have been more wrong. He had given me a test. And more importantly, he had given me a choice. I could become bitter. I could spend my life trying to punish everyone who had underestimated me. Or I could take what happened, learn from it, and use the opportunity to become someone my grandfather would have been proud of. I chose the second. Before I left, I sat inside the Explorer and turned on the GPS. The save destination still said home. I smiled. For the first time, I understood what Arthur had meant. Home wasn't a house, it wasn't a bank account, it wasn't a family name. Home was the place where you could finally stop proving your worth. I turned off the GPS. Then I started the engine. As I drove down the mountain, I realized the greatest revenge wasn't watching my father lose everything. It wasn't watching my brother apologize. It wasn't proving that I was worth more than they thought. The greatest revenge was refusing to become the kind of person who had hurt me. My grandfather left millions behind. But what he really left me was something harder to measure. Wisdom, responsibility, and the courage to choose who I wanted to become. Maybe that's the lesson worth remembering. Sometimes, life gives you something that looks worthless, because you're looking at its price instead of its purpose. Sometimes the people who underestimate you are accidentally giving you freedom. And sometimes forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting what happened. It means learning from it without allowing it to poison the rest of your life. So, if this story reminded you of someone who was underestimated, betrayed, or judged by what they had instead of who they were, share it with them. And if you've ever discovered that the hardest seasons of your life were secretly preparing you for something better, I'd love for you to stay with me for the next story. Because sometimes the greatest inheritance isn't what someone leaves in your name,